What happens when a company is not just buying a product, but buying capability, expertise, access, or outcomes? Today, I will discuss non-traditional contracting, which refers to contractual approaches that go beyond simple routine purchase agreements or standard long-term supply contracts. These arrangements are usually adopted when the buyer faces high uncertainty, complex service requirements, advanced technology, or the need for specialized expertise. In supply chain and purchasing practice, non-traditional contracting is important because organizations increasingly buy not just product but also capabilities, performance, systems, knowledge, and outcomes. In other words, the contract becomes a tool for managing risk, innovation, collaboration, and long-term value rather than price. So in this presentation, I will move from IT system providers or contracts to consultant, minority business owners, different types of service providers. Then I will cover the construction contracts and finally digital and e-commerce contracting. One major form of non-traditional contracting is the IT system contract. These contracts are designed to give organizations access to expensive software, networks, platforms, or technical infrastructure that they may not be able to develop or finance alone. The slides identify providers such as SAP, Oracle, IBM, EDS, which are all associated with large-scale enterprise systems and outsourced technology solutions. The reason these contracts are considered non-traditional is that they are not just about buying a product once. Instead, they typically involve implementation, integration, maintenance, user support, upgrades, and long-term dependence on the provider. The key risk is lock-in. A purchaser or the buyer may sign a contract that seems reasonable at the start, but later the agreement no longer reflects realities. User demand may change, the cost of computing may fall, or technology may improve dramatically, yet the buyer remains tied to an old pricing structure or service model. A useful global example is IBM's own HR system transformation with SAP, where a large enterprise integrated multiple SAP success factors model, governance structure, and connected platform over multi-year period. This illustrates that systems contracting is not a simple software purchase. It is a strategic transformation contract involving governance, service design, and adoption risk. When we examine IT systems contracts more closely, we can distinguish between three levels of service: turnkey, modular, and shared. These three models represent different levels of supplier responsibility and buyer control. First, in a turnkey arrangement, the supplier takes full responsibility for delivering the complete solution. The buyer expects a finished system that is ready to operate. This can be efficient, but it is also create strong dependency on the vendor. The second one is a modular arrangement. The buyer adopts the service in stages. For example, a company might outsource payroll first, then talent management, then analytics. This staged approach reduces risk and allows trust and capabilities to build gradually. Third, in a shared arrangement, the buyer and supplier jointly manage the system. This is common when the buyer wants outside expertise but still wishes to retain strategic control, data oversight, or part of operational capability. From a supply chain management perspective, this is very important. The contract model should match the organization's risk tolerance, internal capability, strategic importance of the system, and the need for flexibility. There are three issues that are central to non-traditional contracts, especially the IT system contracts, mainly price, performance, and procedure. On price, the buyer must decide whether to accept fixed, all-inclusive fees or more flexible pricing formulas. Fixed pricing can provide budget certainty, but it may become inefficient if the market changes. Flexible pricing, on the other hand, can provide better reflection to the changes in demand, but it requires strong audit rights and transparent cost tracking. On performance, the contract must define how success will actually be measured. That means clear service levels, milestones, response times, uptime targets, implementation deadlines, and quality indicators. Without measurable performance or without clear terms for measuring these performance indicators, contract management become vague and disputes become more likely. Also here, I want to point out to offshoring, which means outsourcing to a country cross borders to a different country. And for information technology, a good example of that will be India. And here we need to understand that lower cost does not eliminate the need for strong performance control. So we need to understand that offshoring might initially reduce the costs, but it might come with its own risk. And on procedure, organizations need a detailed conversion plan. How the transition will happen, who owns the data, what acceptance criteria will be applied, and what happens if the supplier fails to perform. This logic also appears in Oman public procurement environment. Oman's tender law allows several procurement routes beyond ordinary public tendering, including limited tender, engagement, direct assignment, and competition for technical works. At the same time, it emphasizes fairness, competition, and controlled negotiation, which shows that even flexible contracting models still require a formal governance framework. The other type of non-traditional contracting is outsourcing. And here we are talking about 3PLs or service providers. Organizations outsource many other services other than the IT, such as logistics support, maintenance, facilities, call centers, analytics, and specialized back office processes. The academic idea here is that firms increasingly use contracts to access external expertise and scalability, especially in activities that are important but not necessarily a core competitive advantage. However, outsourcing should not be viewed as an automatic cost-saving solution. The real question is whether the contract improves total value, including flexibility, service quality, managerial focus, and risk control. That is why modern supply chain literature increasingly emphasizes relational contracting, performance-based arrangements, and strategic alignment rather than simple low-price outsourcing. Third type of non-traditional contracting is minority or women-owned business enterprise contracts, often referred to as MWBE arrangement. The core idea here is that contracting can also serve a public policy objective, not just a commercial one. So buyers, especially public sectors or highly regulated organizations, must show how procurement support inclusion, supplier diversity, and broader economic participation. So the contract become part of a corrective mechanism for underrepresentation. This is a good reminder that contracts do not operate in a purely private market context. They are also influenced by legal, social, and institutional priorities. A related point in Oman is the increasing emphasis on local economic participation. For example, U.S. International Trade Administration noticed that in-country value, or ICV, is embedded in Omani government tenders and encourages firms to invest locally, source locally, and build domestic capability. So while the terminology differs from MWBE policy, the broader principle is similar. Procurement is used not only to buy efficiently but also to shape development outcome. So again, in Oman we call it in-country value, ICV, instead of minority women-owned business. Another type of non-traditional contracting is consulting contract. Here, the buyer is not mainly purchasing a physical good or even an operating system, but rather knowledge, judgment, expertise, and temporary specialists' capability. Consulting contracts are especially useful when the organization faces a strategic issue, a capability gap, an implementation challenge, or a need for external objectivity. However, consulting is inherently difficult to contract because the deliverable is often intangible. That means the contract must carefully define the scope, the outputs, timelines, responsibilities, confidentialities, and how the organization will judge whether the consultant has truly delivered value or not. Before hiring an outside consultant, the buyer must be clear about the purpose of the engagement. Is the goal to obtain technical expertise? Is it to speed up implementation? Is it to provide an independent diagnosis? Or is it to transfer knowledge into the organization? If those goals are not explicit, then even a highly qualified consultant may still fail from the client's point of view. In practice, organizations often confuse activity with value. A consultant may produce reports, workshops, and meetings, but the real question whether the engagement improves decision, capabilities, compliance, or performance. So, the contract should translate organizational goals into defined deliverables and measurable outcomes. In consultant contracts, the term matters because the risk is often hidden in ambiguity. A strong consulting arrangement should normally address at least 6 issues. First, scope of work. Exactly what the consultant will and will not do. Second, deliverables and milestones, reports, plans, models, training sessions, or implementation support. Third, fees and payment triggers. For example, fixed fees, milestones-based payment, or time and materials. Fourth, confidentiality and data protection, especially if the consultant handles sensitive commercial information. Fifth, intellectual property rights. Who owns the method, reports, code, and designs created during the engagement. And six, termination and dispute procedures in case the relationship does not work as intended. In supply chain terms, the objectives is to prevent misunderstandings by converting an intangible service into a clearly governed contractual relationship. Let's talk about a different type of non-traditional contracting, which is construction contracts. We can consider them as a unique non-traditional contracting because they involve multiple stages, multiple actors, and significant execution risk. The phrase sequence of event is especially important here. A construction contract does not begin and end with award. It moves through a sequence. For example, project definition, design, tendering, evaluation, contract award, mobilization, execution, inspection, variation management, completion, and final handover. Each stage creates a different contractual issue. For example, design uncertainty may lead to later claims. Delay may trigger penalties. Changes in scope may require variations orders. Safety failures may create legal and reputational damage. This stage nature of construction contracting explains why procurement laws often provide special procedures for technical projects. In Oman, the tender law includes a method called competition for studies, designs, layouts, and other technical works, which is highly relevant when the buyer cannot fully define the solution in advance. So the construction contracts includes many terms. For example, a stated completion period, realistic timetable, overhead costs, safety requirements, cost summaries or detailed cost summaries, contractual claims, and liquidate damage clauses. Together, these points shows that construction contracting is really about structured risk allocation. Time risk is addressed through completion period and timetables. Cost risk is managed through summaries, overhead controls, and claims procedure. Performance and safety risks are managed through technical requirements and compliance obligations. Delay risk is addressed through liquidate damages. A useful point here is that construction contracts must balance certainty and flexibility. The contract must be strict enough to control time, cost, and safety, but flexible enough to handle unforeseen conditions. This is also why many contracts in Oman and elsewhere rely on formal standard conditions and performance guarantees. According to the Oman a public sector guide, successful bidders are generally required to provide a performance bond, and contracts are not necessarily awarded only to the lowest price. Other types of contracts we can discuss here is purchasing agreements and online catalogs and e-commerce contracts. And these can include framework agreements, agency agreements, managed service contracts, performance-based logistics agreements, public-private partnerships, and digital platforms arrangements. The common features across all of them is that they are designed to manage complexity, specializations, uncertainty, or long-term interdependence. There are different types of purchasing agreement. For example, annual contracts, and these ones run for a 12 months period and may or may not come up for renewal at the end of the year. Also, we do have national contracts, and these ones specify the purchaser will buy a certain amount of goods and services for the duration of the agreement, corporate agreements. Then we do have national buying agreements, and here it is non-bidding on either the purchaser or the supplier. Typically, provide discounts to the corporate buyers based on the total volume for the corporate as a whole, not for any sub unit individually. Also, we do have blanket order, which covers different items that can be purchased under the same purchase order number, thus minimizing repetitive paperwork in the purchasing department for relatively low cost items like office supplies and so on. Also, we do have a pricing agreement where a buyer is allowed to automatically discount the published purchase price by a negotiated percentage for all purchases from a given price list or catalog during the contract period. Also, we do have open-ended orders, and open-ended orders are similar to the blanket orders but allow the addition of items not originally included in the blanket order. It may also allow the original purchase order to be extended for longer term. These slides bring the discussion into the digital environment through online catalogs and e-commerce contracts. The key issue is that digital procurement may look simpler operationally, but legally and managerially it introduces new concerns. Buyer and sellers need to consider pricing accuracy, automated ordering terms, acceptance of electronic agreements, record retention, cybersecurity, data protection, system access, and dispute resolutions across the digital channel. In Oman, this topic is increasingly relevant. The government has launched Takamul recently, a national digital system for project management and government procurement that covers planning, contracting, contract execution, supplier relations, and contract management. This shows how contract administration itself is becoming digitized. In addition, Oman issued a new electronic transaction law by Royal Decree 39 over 2025, replacing the earlier 2008 framework, which signals continuing legal modernization of the digital transaction. So the major lesson is this: digitization does not remove the need for contract. In fact, it makes clear terms, data governance, and reinforceable procedures even more important. So the major issues that the buyers and sellers needs to be aware with respect to e-commerce contract is the parity between electronic and paper records, enforceability of click wrap and box top agreements and license, arbitration procedures, and digital signatures. To conclude, non-traditional contracting is important because modern organizations increasingly buy systems, services, expertise, inclusions, outcomes, and digital access rather than only physical goods. As the purchases become more complex, the contract becomes more than a legal formality. It becomes a management tool. The key lesson from this part is that good contracts do not eliminate uncertainty, but they allocate risks intelligently, define expectations clearly, and create the governance needed to manage performance over time. This is why procurement professionals need strong skills not only in price negotiation but also in scope definition, service measurement, supplier relationship, and change control.